Sir, he's having another episode. Henry Whitmore barely looked up from the glowing screen of his tablet. The voice belonged to Margaret, the night nurse assigned to his 5-year-old son, Lucas. Her tone, sharp and tinged with urgency, grated against his concentration. He glanced at the clock on the wall, nearly midnight. "I've already authorized the medication," he replied, his voice clipped. "Handle it." Margaret hesitated at the doorway. "The medication isn't working this time." Henry froze. That had never happened before. He stood, leaving behind the pile of acquisition reports he'd been poring over. His steps were brisk as he moved toward Lucas's room, the familiar sense of helplessness creeping in. It wasn't the first time he'd faced this scenario, but the idea of it spiraling beyond control churned his stomach. Inside the softly lit bedroom, Lucas was curled into himself on the bed, fists clenched tightly against his temples. His breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps, punctuated by faint cries. Margaret stood near him, holding an empty syringe, her expression taut with worry. "What's happening?" Henry demanded. "He's unresponsive," she said. "He's not calming down, and his breathing is erratic." Henry knelt by the bed, his stern facade cracking as he touched Lucas's trembling hand. "Lucas," he said, his voice softer now. "It's okay, buddy. I'm here." The boy didn't react. His face was pale, and his body seemed locked in an invisible grip of anguish. Henry's pulse quickened. Lucas's episodes had always been severe, but this was something new, something worse. "What are you waiting for?" Henry barked at Margaret. "Call Dr. Mitchell. Now." As Margaret scrambled out of the room, Henry stayed by his son's side, frustration and guilt warring within him. He was a man accustomed to solving problems, whether they involved billion-dollar deals or corporate rivalries. Yet here, with his own child, he felt utterly powerless. Hours later, after Lucas had finally been sedated, Henry stood alone in his study, staring out the window at the glittering Chicago skyline. His hands were clenched in his pockets as he replayed the night's events. He had spared no expense on Lucas's care. Specialists, therapists, the best medical equipment money could buy. But none of it seemed to matter. A faint knock interrupted his thoughts. Henry turned to see Margaret standing in the doorway again. "He's stable," she said quietly. "For now." Henry nodded, the weight of relief only slightly easing the tension in his chest. Margaret hesitated, then added, "You're doing the best you can, Mr. Whitmore. But he needs more than medicine." Henry stiffened. "I've provided everything he needs." Margaret looked as though she wanted to say more, but thought better of it. She left him alone with his thoughts, the unspoken criticism hanging in the air. Henry's phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from the silence. A message from his assistant reminded him of an early meeting the next day. Forcing himself to focus, he grabbed his coat and prepared to leave the mansion for a quick drive, something to clear his head. Outside, the winter air bit at his skin as he walked to his car. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, save for the occasional figure huddled in doorways or against alley walls. He barely spared them a glance, his mind occupied by thoughts of Lucas, until he saw her. At first, she was just a figure on the sidewalk, wrapped in a tattered coat and shaking violently. Something about her stopped him. Maybe it was the way she clutched her arms against herself, her movements frantic, or the hollow desperation in her eyes when they briefly met his. Henry hesitated. It wasn't his problem. He had enough on his plate without adding a random stranger to the mix. But as he started to turn away, her voice cut through the cold night air. "Please," she whispered, barely audible. "Help me." The words were simple, yet they pierced through him. Against his better judgment, Henry approached. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she said, her voice weak. Henry frowned. "There's a shelter 3 blocks from here." They're full," she interrupted, shivering violently. "I've tried. Please, I just need somewhere warm for the night." Logic told him to walk away. This wasn't his responsibility, but something about her, a raw, haunted quality, kept him rooted in place. With a sigh, he pulled out his phone and called his driver. "Take her to the house," he instructed when the car arrived. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief, But she didn't argue as the driver helped her into the vehicle. Henry stayed on the sidewalk for a moment, staring after the car as it disappeared down the street. He shook his head and muttered under his breath, "What am I doing?" Returning to the mansion later, he found Sarah sitting awkwardly in the kitchen, nursing a mug of tea. Her hands still trembled, though her face had gained a hint of color. "You can stay tonight," he said curtly. "But only tonight." "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded once and left her there, retreating to his own room. The decision already felt like a mistake, a complication he didn't need. Yet as he lay in bed, the image of her hollow eyes refused to leave his mind. Sleep came fitfully, and with it, an uneasy sense that he had just invited something unpredictable into his carefully controlled world. Henry's alarm buzzed at precisely 6:30 a.m. Routine dictated his life, and this morning was no exception, except for the faint, unfamiliar sound drifting through the house. Laughter. A child's laughter. For a moment, Henry froze, unsure if he was still dreaming. Laughter wasn't a sound that belonged in his home anymore, not since Lucas's condition had worsened. He pulled himself out of bed, still groggy, and followed the noise down the hall. As he approached Lucas's room, the sound grew clearer, blending with a soft voice he didn't recognize. He stopped at the doorway, his breath catching at the sight before him. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, a stuffed bear in one hand and Lucas's favorite puzzle spread out between them. She moved the bear with exaggerated gestures, making silly voices that had Lucas giggling uncontrollably. His face, usually marked by tension and fear, was lit with unrestrained joy. Henry stepped inside, his presence breaking the moment. Lucas looked up, his smile faltering. Sarah, noticing the shift, set the bear down and began to stand. "Good morning," she said cautiously. "What's going on here?" Henry asked, his voice sharp with confusion. Sarah hesitated, glancing between Henry and Lucas. "He was awake early," she said. "I heard him crying, so I thought I'd see if I could help." Henry crossed his arms, skeptical. "Help how?" Lucas's small voice cut through the tension. "She made the bear talk, Dad." Henry's gaze shifted to his son. The words were ordinary, but the lightness in Lucas's tone was extraordinary. It had been months since he'd heard anything resembling enthusiasm in his son's voice. "I hope that was okay," Sarah added, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't mean to overstep." Henry frowned. It wasn't okay. Not really. He didn't even know this woman. Yet, looking at Lucas, he couldn't bring himself to say it. His son seemed calmer, more at ease than he had in ages. "It's fine," he muttered. "Just stay out of the way." Sarah gave a small nod and began gathering the puzzle pieces. Lucas reached out to stop her. "Wait, we didn't finish." "It's okay," Sarah said gently. "Your dad might want some time with you." Lucas glanced at Henry, his hopeful expression wilting slightly. Henry felt the familiar pang of guilt, but before he could respond, Sarah gave Lucas a reassuring smile. "We can finish later," she promised. Lucas brightened at her words, and Henry found himself oddly unsettled by the exchange. Sarah was a stranger, yet she seemed to have a connection with his son that he himself couldn't grasp. Later that morning, Henry sat in the kitchen, nursing his coffee. Sarah entered, her steps hesitant. She had changed into the clean clothes Margaret had found for her, simple and understated, but a vast improvement from the tattered coat she'd arrived in. "I wanted to thank you," she said, standing awkwardly by the counter, "for letting me stay." Henry didn't look up from his cup. "It's one night. Don't read too much into it." Sarah nodded. "But instead of leaving," she lingered, "your son is a special kid." Henry's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "You've known him for less than a day." "I know," she said quickly, "but I've been around children. I had a son." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. Henry didn't press her, but the mention of her son tugged at something buried in him. He looked away, unwilling to let her see the crack in his guarded exterior. "You should eat something," he said instead, deflecting. "The kitchen is stocked." Sarah gave a faint smile, sensing the end of the conversation. "Thank you," she said again, before turning to leave. Henry watched her go, his mind churning. She was an enigma, a stranger who had brought a flicker of peace to a household defined by its struggles. He didn't trust her, not yet, but he couldn't ignore the impact she had on Lucas. As the day stretched on, Henry found himself watching their interactions from a distance. Sarah's patience with Lucas was remarkable. She didn't flinch when his mood shifted, nor did she seem overwhelmed by the challenges of his condition. Instead, she adapted, finding ways to soothe him that Henry wouldn't have considered. By evening, as Lucas drifted off to sleep with Sarah reading softly by his bedside, Henry stood in the hallway, conflicted. He wasn't sure if letting her stay had been the right decision, but for the first time in a long while, his son had smiled. And that, he realized, was something worth holding on to, at least for now. The house was quiet, the kind of silence Henry Whitmore used to crave. Yet now, it unsettled him. He sat in his study, a crystal glass of whiskey untouched on the desk. His mind kept drifting back to the unexpected laughter that had filled the mansion earlier that morning and the woman responsible for it. Sarah. She was still a stranger, a mystery wrapped in layers of grief and resilience. Henry didn't know her story, nor did he particularly want to. But the way Lucas had responded to her, the ease with which she had calmed him, it unnerved him. No one had been able to reach his son like that. Not therapists, not nurses, not even himself. The quiet creak of a floorboard outside the study broke his thoughts. He turned his head sharply to see Sarah lingering in the doorway, her expression cautious. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said quickly. "I just couldn't sleep." Henry gestured toward the armchair by the window. "Sit." She hesitated, then stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the glow from a small desk lamp casting long shadows. She settled into the chair, her posture tense. "Is something wrong?" Henry asked, his tone even but guarded. Sarah shook her head. "No, I wanted to check on Lucas before I went to bed. He seemed peaceful. I didn't want to disturb him." Henry frowned. "You seem awfully invested for someone who just met him." Her gaze met his, steady despite the accusation in his tone. "He reminds me of my son." The word struck a chord Henry hadn't anticipated. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "You mentioned your son before. What happened to him?" Sarah hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. For a moment, Henry thought she wouldn't answer, but then her voice came, soft and measured. "Timmy was 5, she began. "Just like Lucas. He was bright and full of energy, but he had a heart condition. We didn't know until it was too late." She paused, her eyes distant. "One day, he collapsed during a game of tag. We rushed him to the hospital, but there was nothing they could do." Henry didn't interrupt, though the weight of her words settled heavily in the room. "I lost him 2 years ago," Sarah continued. "After that, everything fell apart. My marriage, my job, my home. I ended up, well, you saw where I ended up." Her voice broke slightly on the last sentence, and she quickly composed herself. Henry studied her, his usual skepticism tempered by a flicker of understanding. He recognized the rawness in her eyes, the kind of pain that didn't fade with time. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. It wasn't much, but it was more than he usually offered. Sarah nodded, acknowledging the sentiment. "That's why I connected with Lucas. He reminds me so much of Timmy, not just his age, but the way he looks at the world, like he's trying to find something he can't quite reach." Henry's jaw tightened. The description hit closer to home than he cared to admit. Lucas had always been different, even before his condition worsened. There was a quiet brilliance to him, a curiosity that had been slowly stifled by his struggles. "I just want to help," Sarah added, her voice firm despite its softness. "Not to overstep or make you uncomfortable, but I know what it's like to feel helpless, to watch your child suffer and not know how to fix it." Henry ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "It's not that simple." "I know," Sarah said, "but maybe it doesn't have to be as hard as we make it." Her words lingered in the air as she stood. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore." "Henry," he corrected, almost reflexively. "Call me Henry." She offered a faint smile before leaving the study, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. Alone again, Henry stared at the glass of whiskey, his reflection distorted in the amber liquid. Sarah's story had cracked something in him, though he wasn't ready to name it. Her presence in the house was an anomaly, a disruption to the carefully controlled life he had built. And yet, for the first time in a long while, he wondered if that disruption might be what they all needed. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the dining room, illuminating the quiet hum of the mansion. Henry sat at the head of the table, his coffee untouched. Across from him, Sarah helped Lucas spread butter on a slice of toast, her movements gentle but deliberate. The boy giggled as she exaggerated her instructions, acting as though the knife were too heavy to lift. It was a scene Henry wasn't used to witnessing. Warmth, laughter, and connection. Yet instead of comfort, it brought unease. He cleared his throat, interrupting the moment. "Lucas," he said, his tone firm, "finish your breakfast. You have therapy this morning." The boy's face fell, but he obeyed, setting the knife down and focusing on his plate. Sarah glanced at Henry, her expression unreadable, but she said nothing. Once Lucas had been taken upstairs by Margaret, Henry turned to Sarah. "We need to talk." Sarah leaned back in her chair, bracing herself. "About what?" "Boundaries," Henry said, his voice sharp. "I appreciate what you've done for Lucas. Clearly, you've been good for him. But you're crossing lines that weren't meant to be crossed." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Like stepping into roles that aren't yours to fill," Henry replied. "You've been here for less than 48 hours, and you're acting as though this is your home." Her posture stiffened. "I'm not trying to take over, Henry. I'm just trying to help. And I didn't ask for your help," he shot back. "I let you stay because you needed a place to sleep, not because I wanted you to get involved in my family." Sarah held his gaze, unflinching. "Your son needed someone. You weren't there." The words struck him like a blow. His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood, pacing toward the window. The view of the manicured garden did little to calm the storm brewing inside him. "You think you understand this situation because of what you've been through," he said finally, his voice low. "But you don't. Lucas isn't Timmy, and you're not his mother." The air between them grew tense. Sarah's expression softened, though her resolve didn't waver. "You're right," she said quietly. "Lucas isn't my son, but he's still a little boy who needs someone to see him for who he is, not just what's wrong with him." Henry turned to face her. "And you think I don't see him?" "I think you're afraid to," she said, her voice steady but kind. "You're doing everything you can to fix him. Specialists, medication, therapy. But when was the last time you just sat with him? Listened to him?" Henry opened his mouth to retort, but found he didn't have an answer. He hadn't done those things, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how. His relationship with Lucas was defined by logistics, not connection. Sarah rose from her chair, her movements deliberate. "I'm not here to replace you, Henry. I'm here because I care about Lucas. But if you don't want me involved, just say so and I'll leave." Her words hung in the air, a challenge as much as a promise. Henry hesitated, his thoughts racing. He didn't trust her, not entirely. But he couldn't deny that Lucas had been calmer, happier, in the short time she'd been there. "I don't want you to leave," he admitted reluctantly. "But there have to be rules. Clear ones." Sarah nodded. "Fair enough. What do you have in mind?" He hadn't expected her to agree so easily, and it threw him off balance. After a moment, he said, "You'll stay out of Lucas's medical care. That's for me and his doctors to handle." "Understood," Sarah replied. "Anything else?" Henry frowned, searching for additional boundaries, but finding none that didn't feel petty. "That's it for now." She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Then we're on the same page." As she turned to leave, Henry called after her. "Sarah." She paused in the doorway, glancing back. "Thank you," he said, the words coming grudgingly, "for what you've done for Lucas." Her expression softened again, and she nodded. "You're welcome." When she was gone, Henry sat back down at the table, staring at the empty plate Lucas had left behind. He didn't know what this new dynamic meant or how long it would last, but one thing was clear. Sarah was forcing him to confront truths he'd spent years avoiding. And for better or worse, he couldn't look away anymore. Henry spent most of the day holed up in his office, pretending to work while his mind wandered. Sarah's words from breakfast replayed in his head, irritating and undeniable. When was the last time you just sat with him? Listened to him? He dismissed it as overstepping. But now, hours later, the question lingered. Lucas had always been complicated, brilliant but fragile. Henry told himself he had done what any responsible parent would. Sought the best experts, provided every resource. But as the mansion grew quiet that evening, a different thought crept in. Had he hidden behind those efforts to avoid facing his own inadequacies? By the time Margaret came downstairs to announce Lucas was ready for bed, Henry had made a decision. "I'll put him to sleep tonight," he said, startling himself as much as her. Margaret blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Of course, sir. He's just finishing his story with Sarah." Henry's stomach clenched at the mention of her name, but he nodded. He climbed the stairs slowly, rehearsing what he might say to Lucas, how he could explain his sudden presence after so many nights spent at a distance. When he reached the doorway, he paused. The sight inside stopped him cold. Sarah was sitting on the edge of Lucas's bed, holding a book open on her lap. Lucas was curled under the covers, his head resting on her arm as she read aloud. Her voice was soft and rhythmic, filling the room with a kind of calm Henry hadn't realized was missing. For a moment, he considered turning around, letting the moment stay uninterrupted. But then Lucas spotted him. "Dad!" His face lit up, and he pushed himself upright. "You're here." Sarah glanced up, her surprise quickly replaced by understanding. She closed the book and stood. "I'll let you two have some time." Lucas grabbed her hand before she could leave. "But you didn't finish the chapter." She knelt down so they were eye level. "Your dad can finish it for you," she said, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'll read to you tomorrow." Reluctantly, Lucas let her go. Henry watched her leave, feeling a mix of gratitude and discomfort. She had handled the transition seamlessly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Can you read this part?" Lucas asked, handing him the book. His voice held a note of hesitation, as if he wasn't entirely sure Henry would agree. Henry took the book and sat on the edge of the bed. "Sure. Where were you?" Lucas pointed to the middle of the page. Henry cleared his throat and began to read. The words felt foreign at first, but as he continued, he noticed Lucas leaning closer, his small hand resting on Henry's arm. It was a subtle gesture, but it struck Henry with unexpected force. By the time he finished the chapter, Lucas's eyes were heavy with sleep. He yawned and settled back against the pillows. "Thanks, Dad," he mumbled. Henry reached out, smoothing the blanket over his son. "Good night, buddy." As he stood to leave, Lucas's voice stopped him. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Do you think Sarah will stay?" The question caught Henry off guard. "I don't know," he admitted. "I like her," Lucas said, his voice barely audible. "She makes things less scary." Henry stared at him for a moment, the weight of the statement settling over him. "I'll do my best to keep things less scary too," he promised, though the words felt clumsy and insufficient. Lucas nodded, his eyes drifting shut. Henry stood there for a moment longer, watching his son sleep. Then he quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. In the hallway, he found Sarah sitting on the bench by the window, gazing out at the darkened garden. She turned when she heard him, her expression neutral. "How'd it go?" she asked. "He's asleep," Henry replied. He hesitated before adding, "He asked if you were staying." Her brows lifted in mild surprise. "And what did you say?" "I told him I didn't know." Sarah nodded, her face unreadable. "Fair answer." Henry leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "You seem to have a knack for making him feel safe." "It's not a knack," she said simply. "It's love." The words hung in the air, straightforward yet profound. Henry didn't respond, unsure of what to say. Instead, he watched her for a moment longer before retreating to his study. The evening had left him more unsettled than ever, but for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something new, something unfamiliar. Hope. The following morning, Henry sat at the breakfast table, the quiet hum of his tablet filling the room. Lucas, still in his pajamas, was occupied with a plate of scrambled eggs. Across the table, Sarah helped him pour a glass of juice, her casual presence a stark contrast to the rigidity that had once defined their mornings. "You have therapy later," Henry said to Lucas without looking up, his eyes fixed on a new report. Lucas frowned but didn't argue. Sarah's gaze flicked toward Henry, a faint crease of concern on her brow. "What kind of therapy does he do?" Henry glanced up, his tone clipped. "Occupational and speech. Twice a week." "That's good," she said, nodding thoughtfully. "But have you ever tried alternative therapies? Like art or music?" Henry stiffened. Lucas's condition isn't something that can be solved with finger painting. Her tone remained even. "I wasn't suggesting it as a solution, just as a way to let him express himself." Henry's eyes narrowed. "I think I've done enough research to know what's best for my son." The room went quiet, the tension palpable. Lucas's fork clattered against his plate as he looked between them, his small face uncertain. Sarah exhaled slowly and changed the subject. "Lucas, why don't you go grab your sneakers? We can get ready for the day." Lucas nodded quickly, eager to escape the tension. As soon as he was out of earshot, Henry turned to Sarah, his voice low and sharp. "If you have opinions about my parenting, keep them to yourself." "I wasn't criticizing you," she said, meeting his glare evenly. "I'm just offering a perspective you might not have considered." "I don't need your perspective." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Maybe not, but Lucas might." Henry opened his mouth to respond but stopped. He didn't have the energy for another confrontation. Instead, he pushed his chair back abruptly and left the room. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Henry buried himself in work, trying to ignore the undercurrent of frustration that lingered after his argument with Sarah. By the time evening rolled around, he was exhausted but no closer to shaking the irritation. It was Lucas who finally pulled him out of his spiral. "Dad." Lucas stood in the doorway of Henry's study, clutching a piece of paper. His small hands were smudged with paint. Henry set his pen down. "What's up, buddy?" "I made this for you." Lucas walked over, holding out the paper. It was a colorful mess of lines and shapes, but in the center, there was a clear depiction of a man holding hands with a smaller figure. Henry stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. "Is this us?" Lucas nodded. "Sarah said we should make something that makes us happy." Henry blinked, caught off guard. "She helped you with this?" Lucas shrugged. "She just gave me the idea. I did it." Henry studied the drawing again. It wasn't just a collection of scribbles. It was a connection, an unspoken bridge between him and his son. For a moment, he was at a loss for words. "Thanks, buddy," he said finally, his voice softer than he intended. "It's really good." Lucas beamed, his smile wide and genuine. "I'll make another tomorrow." "Yeah," Henry said, nodding. "I'd like that." After Lucas left, Henry sat alone with the drawing, the weight of the day settling over him. He thought about Sarah's earlier comment, the way she had pushed back without breaking. She was infuriating, yes, but she was also right in ways he wasn't ready to admit. Later that evening, Henry found Sarah in the garden, sitting on the stone bench beneath the soft glow of the outdoor lights. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary but curious. "I owe you an apology," he said, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "For this morning." She tilted her head, surprised. "What brought that on?" Henry sighed. "Lucas showed me a drawing he made. He said it was your idea." Sarah smiled faintly. "He's a creative kid. He just needed a little encouragement." Henry nodded, his gaze distant. "I'm not good at this," he admitted. "Being a dad. No one's perfect at it," she replied. "But you care about him. That counts for more than you think." They sat in silence for a moment, the cool night air wrapping around them. Finally, Henry spoke again. "You should stay." Sarah looked at him, her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "For a while," he clarified. "Lucas, he needs someone like you. And maybe I do too." Her expression softened, but she didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I'll stay." "For Lucas." Henry nodded, the unspoken understanding between them settling into place. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sliver of something he hadn't allowed himself to hope for. The possibility of change. The days that followed were quieter, almost peaceful. For the first time, Henry began to notice a rhythm forming in the household. One that didn't solely revolve around schedules, therapies, or his relentless pursuit of control. It was a rhythm Sarah seemed to have introduced without even trying. Lucas's laughter became a regular sound, breaking through the usual silence that had filled the mansion. It wasn't forced or fleeting. It was natural, spontaneous. Henry found himself lingering outside the playroom more often, drawn by the unfamiliar joy that echoed from within. One afternoon, as Henry returned from a business call, he paused by the living room doorway. Sarah and Lucas were sprawled on the floor, a board game between them. Lucas was animated, his small hands waving as he explained the rules to Sarah, who listened intently, her focus entirely on him. "Your turn, Sarah," Lucas said, pointing at the dice. She picked them up, shaking them with exaggerated enthusiasm before rolling. "Ooh, a 6. What does that mean?" Lucas clapped his hands. "You get to move to the castle." Sarah gasped in mock excitement. "The castle? Do I get a crown too?" Lucas giggled, and Henry found himself smiling without realizing it. "You're not going easy on her, are you, buddy?" Henry asked, stepping into the room. Lucas turned to him, grinning. "Nope. She's almost winning, though." Henry crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Impressive." "He doesn't usually let anyone win." Sarah looked up at him, her smile warm but teasing. "Maybe I'm just that good." For a moment, Henry allowed himself to relax, to bask in the lightness of the scene. He hadn't seen Lucas this engaged, this happy, in a long time, and he couldn't deny that Sarah had brought something into their lives that he hadn't even realized was missing. But the ease of the moment didn't last. That evening, as Henry and Sarah stood in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, the conversation took a turn. It started innocently enough, with Sarah asking questions about Lucas's favorite foods and hobbies. Then she hesitated, as though debating whether to speak. "Henry," she said carefully, "have you ever thought about taking a step back from work?" He frowned, glancing at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're always so busy," she said, her tone tentative but firm. "And Lucas notices." "He might not say it, but he does." Henry set the dish he was drying down, his jaw tightening. "My work is what keeps this house running. It's what ensures Lucas has the best care." "I'm not saying it's not important," Sarah replied, "but maybe being around more, really being present, could make a bigger difference than you think." Henry's first instinct was to push back, to dismiss her suggestion as another overreach. But her words stirred something inside him, something he wasn't ready to face. He looked away, his silence stretching. "Forget I said anything," Sarah said quickly, sensing the tension. "I just thought—" "No," Henry interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "You're not wrong." She blinked, surprised. "I've been distant," he admitted, the words heavy in his mouth. "Not just with Lucas, but with everything. It's easier to bury myself in work than to deal with other things." Sarah's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, her voice gentle. "It's not about being perfect, Henry. It's about showing up. That's all Lucas really wants." Henry nodded, though the weight of the conversation lingered. He wasn't sure how to change, how to bridge the gap he'd built between himself and his son. But for the first time, he was willing to try. The next morning, Henry cleared his schedule. When Lucas came downstairs, he was greeted not by Margaret, but by Henry, who was holding a soccer ball. "Want to kick this around outside?" Henry asked. Lucas's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" Henry said, smiling. The hesitation in Lucas's expression was fleeting, replaced quickly by excitement. "Okay." As they headed to the yard, Sarah watched from the kitchen window, a quiet satisfaction in her expression. The shift was small, but it was real, and it was only the beginning. The crisp autumn air filled the yard as Henry and Lucas passed the soccer ball back and forth. At first, Lucas's kicks were hesitant, but as he gained confidence, his laughter grew louder. Henry found himself caught up in the simplicity of the moment, focusing on nothing but his son's happiness. "Kick it harder, Dad," Lucas called, his cheeks flushed. Henry grinned and gave the ball a firm nudge, sending it rolling across the yard. Lucas sprinted after it, his small legs moving with a determination that made Henry's chest tighten with pride. This was what he had been missing. Moments like this, unburdened by expectations or schedules. From the patio, Sarah watched with a smile, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She didn't intervene or comment, simply observing as father and son found a rhythm that had eluded them for so long. But the day's lightness was short-lived. That evening, as Lucas settled in for bed, Sarah lingered in the hallway outside his room. Henry noticed her pause and frowned. Something wrong? She shook her head, but her eyes told a different story. He reminds me so much of Timmy, she admitted quietly. Henry's expression softened. You've mentioned him before. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but I'd like to know more. About him? Sarah hesitated, as if weighing the vulnerability of sharing. Finally, she leaned against the wall, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. Timmy was curious about everything, she began. He loved puzzles, animals, and especially space. He used to say he was going to be an astronaut one day. I believed him. Henry listened intently, the image of a bright, energetic boy forming in his mind. What happened? He asked gently. Sarah's gaze dropped. His heart condition was something we didn't know about until it was too late. One moment, he was playing tag in the backyard, and the next, he was gone. Just like that. Henry didn't interrupt, sensing the depth of her pain. Sarah's voice grew quieter as she continued. I tried to keep it together, but losing him, it broke me. My marriage couldn't survive it, and I didn't have anyone else. Eventually, I just lost everything. She looked up, her eyes meeting Henry's. That's why being here, helping Lucas, it feels like I have a purpose again. Like I can honor Timmy by making a difference. Henry nodded, her words sinking in. He hadn't allowed himself to think about loss in such a personal way before. His life had been built around avoiding pain, not confronting it. But hearing Sarah's story, he couldn't help but feel a sense of connection. You've done more for Lucas in a few days than I have in months, he admitted, his voice quiet. I'm not sure how to even start making up for that. Sarah shook her head. You're already starting, Henry. You spent the afternoon playing soccer with him. That's what he'll remember. Not how perfect you were, but that you were there. Henry absorbed her words, feeling the weight of them settle over him. For the first time, he realized that being present wasn't just about time. It was about intention. As the house fell silent that night, Henry found himself staring at a photo of Lucas as a toddler, his chubby face beaming with unrestrained joy. The photo had been taken by Emma, his late wife, during one of the rare moments they'd all spent together as a family. It had been years since he'd looked at it closely. He thought about Sarah's story, the strength it must have taken for her to keep going after losing Timmy. And he thought about Lucas, who deserved more than just care. He deserved a father who truly saw him. The echoes of loss were still there, reverberating in both their lives. But for the first time, Henry began to believe that those echoes didn't have to define them. They could build something new, together. The morning brought a quiet energy to the house, one that felt different from the usual routines. Henry found himself lingering over his coffee, listening to the faint hum of Sarah and Lucas chatting in the other room. The sound carried a warmth that had been absent from his home for years. When Sarah entered the kitchen, she carried a folder in her hands, her expression a mix of hesitation and determination. I've been thinking about what you said the other day, she began. Henry raised an eyebrow, unsure where she was going. Which part? The part about how you've done everything you can for Lucas, she said, placing the folder on the counter. I believe you, but I also think there's room to try something different. She opened the folder to reveal brochures and printouts. Henry leaned over, scanning the words. Equine therapy, music therapy for children, alternative paths to emotional growth. Where did you get these? He asked. I did some research last night, Sarah admitted. I know it's not a magic fix, but I've seen kids thrive when they're given outlets that don't feel like therapy. Henry frowned, his instinct to push back bubbling up. Lucas doesn't need to be a test subject for. It's not about that, Sarah interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. It's about giving him a chance to explore, to feel in control of something. Therapy is great, but sometimes kids need to heal in ways that aren't clinical. Henry's eyes lingered on one of the brochures, a photo of a boy on horseback smiling broadly. He sighed, closing the folder. I don't know, Sarah. This feels unorthodox. Unorthodox doesn't mean ineffective, she countered. Look, you don't have to decide right now. Just think about it. Henry hesitated, but something in her earnestness gave him pause. I'll consider it, he said finally. Good, Sarah said with a small smile. That's all I'm asking. The rest of the day passed uneventfully until Lucas came bounding into Henry's office later that afternoon. Dad, Lucas exclaimed, holding a piece of paper. Look what Sarah and I made. Henry set his pen down and took the paper. It was a simple schedule, written in colorful markers, with blocks of time labeled play, reading, and quiet moments. She said we should make a routine that's fun, not boring, Lucas explained, his excitement palpable. Henry smiled despite himself. Looks like a good plan. Will you do it with us? Lucas asked, his wide eyes hopeful. Henry hesitated. The pull of his endless to-do list was strong, but so was the look on his son's face. Sure, he said. When do we start? Lucas grinned and pointed to the first block of the schedule. Outdoor play, 4 p.m. At precisely 4 o'clock, Henry found himself outside with Lucas and Sarah, a frisbee in hand. The game started awkwardly, with Henry unsure of the rules or how to navigate the easy banter between Sarah and Lucas. But as the minutes passed, he began to relax. Lucas shrieked with laughter when Sarah pretended to miss a catch, stumbling dramatically onto the grass. Henry couldn't help but chuckle, his own competitiveness kicking in as he aimed a throw directly at her. Nice try, Henry, Sarah teased, catching the frisbee effortlessly. But you'll have to do better than that. The playful exchange felt foreign but welcome, a far cry from the cold, structured interactions that had defined Henry's relationship with Lucas until now. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, they were all out of breath, sitting on the grass as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. Lucas leaned against Henry's arm, his exhaustion evident but his smile unwavering. This was fun, Lucas said softly. Can we do it again tomorrow? Henry glanced at Sarah, who gave him an encouraging nod. Yeah, buddy, Henry said, ruffling Lucas's hair. We can. Later that night, as Henry sat alone in his study, he opened the folder Sarah had given him earlier. The brochures no longer felt unorthodox. They felt like possibilities. For the first time, he began to consider that healing, for both Lucas and himself, might not come from doing what he had always done. It might require something new, something he hadn't yet imagined. He picked up his phone and dialed the number on the equine therapy brochure. When a voice answered on the other end, Henry said, I'd like to schedule a session for my son. As he hung up, a faint smile played on his lips. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. And that, he realized, was all that mattered. The drive to the equine therapy center was unusually quiet. Lucas sat in the back seat, clutching a stuffed animal, his wide eyes fixed on the passing scenery. Henry glanced at him through the rearview mirror, searching for signs of hesitation or fear. Instead, Lucas looked curious, almost intrigued. You excited? Henry asked, his tone light. Lucas shrugged. I guess. What if the horses don't like me? Henry chuckled. I'm pretty sure they will. Sarah says animals are good at knowing when someone's kind. Lucas didn't respond, but his small smile hinted at relief. When they arrived, the center was bustling with activity. Children and adults moved about the fenced pastures, some leading horses while others brushed their coats. The air smelled of hay and earth, grounding and unfamiliar. Henry felt a twinge of apprehension, but pushed it aside as a cheerful woman in a wide-brimmed hat approached them. You must be the Whitmores, she said, extending a hand. I'm Beth. Welcome to our therapy center. Henry shook her hand firmly. Thanks for having us. Beth crouched to Lucas's level, her smile warm. And you must be Lucas. Do you like animals? Lucas nodded shyly, clutching his stuffed animal tighter. Well, I think you're going to love meeting our horses. Would you like to come see them? Lucas glanced at Henry, who nodded encouragingly. Taking Beth's hand, Lucas followed her toward the stables, his steps tentative but eager. Henry trailed behind, keeping a careful eye on his son while trying not to hover. Inside the stable, the rich scent of hay mixed with the soft sounds of snorting and hooves shifting against the dirt floor. Beth led them to a large, gentle-looking horse with a chestnut coat. "This is Daisy," Beth said, patting the horse's neck. "She's very friendly and loves meeting new friends." Lucas stared up at the towering animal, his eyes wide. "She's big," Beth chuckled. "She is, but she's also very gentle. Would you like to pet her?" Lucas hesitated, then reached out a small hand. Daisy lowered her head, sniffing Lucas's fingers before nuzzling them softly. Lucas giggled, his initial nervousness melting away. "She likes you," Beth said with a grin. "Would you like to brush her coat?" Lucas nodded enthusiastically, and Beth handed him a soft brush. As Lucas worked, Beth explained how grooming helped build trust between the horse and the person. Henry watched, amazed at how quickly Lucas seemed to relax. His son, who often struggled with focus and confidence, appeared completely absorbed in the moment. "You can try leading her, too," Beth said after a while, handing Lucas the reins. "I'll be right here to help." Lucas's eyes lit up as he carefully took the reins. With Beth's guidance, he led Daisy in a slow circle around the stable. Henry felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched. It was such a simple act, but the pride on Lucas's face made it monumental. After the session ended, Beth walked them back to the parking lot. "Lucas did great for his first time," she said. "Horses are incredible for building confidence and emotional connections. I think he'll thrive here." Henry nodded, his gratitude evident. "Thank you, Beth. We'll definitely be back." In the car on the way home, Lucas couldn't stop talking about Daisy. His words tumbled out in a torrent of excitement, and Henry found himself smiling more than he had in weeks. "Dad, did you see how she followed me? And she wasn't even scared of me," Lucas said, his voice brimming with pride. "I saw," Henry said. "You did an amazing job. Can Sarah come next time?" Lucas asked, his tone hopeful. Henry glanced at him in the mirror, then nodded. "I think she'd like that." When they arrived home, Sarah was waiting in the living room, a book open on her lap. Lucas ran to her, launching into an animated retelling of the session. Henry stood back, watching the way Sarah listened with genuine enthusiasm, asking questions and encouraging Lucas to share every detail. Later that night, after Lucas was asleep, Henry found Sarah in the kitchen, tidying up. "You were right," he said, leaning against the counter. "The therapy. It's exactly what he needed." Sarah paused, looking up at him with a small smile. "I'm glad. How did it feel for you?" Henry considered the question, searching for the right words. "It felt good. Seeing him so confident, so happy. It was like I finally saw the boy I knew was still there." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "He's always been there, Henry. He just needed a chance to show it." For once, Henry didn't feel defensive or inadequate. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. It wasn't about perfection. It was about trying. And today, he had tried and succeeded in a way that mattered most. As he turned in for the night, Henry glanced at the calendar on his desk. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to what tomorrow might bring. The days following the equine therapy session were a revelation for Henry. Lucas's energy shifted, his once tense demeanor giving way to a lightness that hadn't been present in years. Every evening, Lucas regaled Sarah with stories about Daisy and the other horses, his enthusiasm infectious. "Can we go back tomorrow?" Lucas asked one night as Henry tucked him in. "Not tomorrow, buddy," Henry replied, smoothing the blanket over Lucas. "But next week, for sure." Lucas's face fell for only a moment before he nodded. "Okay, but Daisy's gonna miss me." "I'm sure she will," Henry said with a chuckle. "You're her favorite after all." As Lucas drifted off to sleep, Henry lingered by the bedside, marveling at how quickly his son had grown. There was still so much he didn't know about Lucas's inner world, but for the first time, Henry felt like he was beginning to understand it. Downstairs, Sarah was folding laundry in the living room, a faint hum escaping her lips as she worked. Henry watched her for a moment before speaking. "Lucas wants to go back tomorrow," he said, sitting on the armrest of the couch. Sarah smiled without looking up. Of course he does. He's found something he loves. Henry nodded, his gaze distant. It's more than that. It's like he's waking up. He's more engaged, more confident. That's what happens when kids feel seen, Sarah said simply, folding a shirt neatly before placing it on the pile. Henry hesitated before continuing. I've been thinking about what you said, about being more present. Sarah looked up, surprised but curious. And you were right, Henry admitted. I've spent so much time trying to fix things from a distance. I thought providing the best care meant being hands-off. But Lucas doesn't need me to solve every problem. He just needs me. Sarah's smile was soft, encouraging. That's a big realization, Henry. It's not easy to admit. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the compliment. I still have a lot to figure out, but I want to do better. Sarah set the laundry aside, leaning forward slightly. You are doing better. Look at today. Look at how happy he's been since the therapy session. That's because of you. Henry shook his head. That's because of you, Sarah. You're the one who suggested it. You're the one who's been connecting with him in ways I couldn't. Her expression grew serious. You're giving me too much credit. I've helped, sure, but you're his father. None of this works without you. The words settled over him, their weight undeniable. Henry wasn't used to sharing credit or responsibility with anyone, but Sarah's steady presence had made it clear that this journey wasn't one he had to navigate alone. The next morning, Henry made a point of changing his routine. Instead of diving into emails and conference calls, he sat with Lucas at breakfast, asking about his favorite parts of the therapy session. Lucas lit up, his hands waving as he described Daisy's funny sneeze and how he wanted to teach her tricks. Sarah watched the exchange from across the table, her smile unspoken but visible in her eyes. After breakfast, Henry announced his intention to take Lucas to the park, an activity that once would have been relegated to a nanny or therapist. At the park, Henry marveled at Lucas's boundless energy. The boy climbed, ran, and slid with a freedom that was contagious. Henry found himself chasing Lucas around the jungle gym, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. Bet you can't catch me, Lucas called, darting toward the swings. Is that a challenge? Henry shot back, breaking into a jog. They played until Lucas was breathless, his cheeks flushed with joy. As they sat on a bench catching their breath, Lucas leaned against Henry's side, his small body warm and content. Dad, Lucas said quietly, this is the best day ever. Henry's throat tightened, but he managed to smile. Yeah, buddy, it's a pretty good day. When they returned home, Sarah greeted them with 2 mugs of hot cocoa and an approving smile. Looks like you two had fun. We did, Lucas said, bounding into the kitchen to grab his favorite marshmallows. Henry lingered in the doorway, his eyes meeting Sarah's. Thank you, he said, his voice low. For what? She asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. For showing me what I was missing, Henry replied. And for being here. For Lucas. For both of us. Sarah's smile widened, but she didn't push the moment further. You're welcome, Henry. But like I said, you've been doing the hard work. That evening, as the house quieted down, Henry found himself reflecting on the day. It hadn't been perfect. Lucas had gotten frustrated on the swings, and Henry had nearly spilled an entire thermos of coffee, but it had been real, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. As he prepared for bed, Henry glanced at the calendar on his desk. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but he was ready. For Lucas, for himself, for whatever came next. The day of Lucas's next equine therapy session arrived with a new sense of anticipation. Henry, Sarah, and Lucas piled into the car together for the first time. Lucas was practically buzzing in the back seat, recounting every detail he remembered about Daisy, while Sarah listened with an amused smile. As they pulled into the therapy center's gravel driveway, Beth greeted them warmly, her wide-brimmed hat tilted against the sun. Lucas, Daisy's been waiting for you, she said, waving them over. Lucas bolted from the car, running ahead toward the stables. Henry and Sarah followed at a more measured pace, the tension between them from weeks earlier now replaced by an easy camaraderie. He's thriving here, Sarah said as they walked. Henry nodded. It's good to see. I didn't think something so Unconventional would work. Sometimes unconventional is exactly what we need, Sarah replied. Inside the stables, Lucas was already brushing Daisy's coat under Beth's guidance. His small hands moved with focus and care, a far cry from the hesitant boy who had been unsure just a week ago. Henry leaned against the stall door, watching with quiet pride. "He's a natural," Beth said, glancing at Henry. "We could start him on basic riding lessons soon, if you're interested." Lucas's head shot up. "Riding? Really?" Beth laughed. "If your dad says yes." Lucas turned to Henry, his eyes wide with hope. Henry hesitated, the protective part of him wary. But then he saw the determination on his son's face, a spark he hadn't seen in years. "Let's give it a shot," Henry said, earning an excited cheer from Lucas. The session continued smoothly, with Lucas leading Daisy around the paddock and practicing commands. Sarah stood by the fence, offering quiet encouragement whenever Lucas looked her way. Beth guided him through the basics, her patient demeanor putting everyone at ease. When the session ended, Lucas ran up to Sarah, breathless and beaming. "Did you see? Daisy did everything I told her." "I saw," Sarah said, crouching to his level. "You were amazing. Daisy's lucky to have you." Lucas hugged her impulsively before running off to find Beth, leaving Sarah momentarily stunned. Henry, standing a few feet away, caught the look on her face. "You're good with him," he said. Sarah stood, brushing dust from her jeans. "He makes it easy." They walked back to the car together, Lucas skipping ahead. For once, the drive home was filled with conversation. Lucas talking animatedly about Daisy, and Henry and Sarah chiming in where they could. Back at the house, as Lucas went to show Margaret a picture Beth had given him, Henry and Sarah lingered in the kitchen. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the windows, softening the edges of the moment. "I've been thinking," Henry said, breaking the silence. "About?" Sarah prompted. "About what happens next," he said, his voice measured. "You've done so much for Lucas. For both of us. And I realized I've never really asked. What do you want, Sarah? Where do you see yourself?" Sarah blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead." Henry leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. "I want you to stay. Not just for Lucas, but because you're part of this now. Of us." Her expression softened, her usual composure faltering slightly. "Henry, I'm not asking for an answer right now," he interrupted, holding up a hand. I needed to say it. You're important, Sarah. To Lucas. To me." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you, Henry. That means more than you know." They stood there in silence, the unspoken possibilities hanging between them. It wasn't a conclusion, not yet, but it was a beginning, one that felt solid and real. That evening, as Henry tucked Lucas into bed, the boy looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Dad, do you think Daisy dreams about me?" Henry smiled, smoothing the blanket over him. "I'm sure she does, buddy." Lucas yawned, his eyes drifting shut. "Good. I dream about her too." As Henry closed the door, he paused in the hallway, his thoughts drifting back to the day's events. For the first time, he felt a sense of balance. A life that wasn't perfect, but full of connection and hope. And for now, that was more than enough. The weeks that followed brought an easy rhythm to their lives, one filled with quiet joys and small victories. Lucas continued his equine therapy, his confidence growing with every session. Henry found himself spending less time buried in work and more time engaged in the everyday moments he had once overlooked. And Sarah, though still cautious, had settled into her role in their lives in a way that felt natural, essential, even. The turning point came on a crisp fall afternoon. The therapy center had invited families for a small showcase, giving the children a chance to demonstrate what they had learned. Lucas was scheduled to ride Daisy for the first time in front of an audience. Henry and Sarah sat on the wooden benches, watching as Lucas mounted the horse with Beth's help. The boy's face was a mixture of nerves and excitement as Daisy began to move. Henry's hands gripped the edge of the bench, his heart pounding as he watched. But Lucas was steady, guiding Daisy with the quiet confidence he had developed over the past weeks. When Lucas completed the small circuit and dismounted, The crowd applauded, and he ran toward Henry and Sarah, his grin wide and triumphant. "Did you see? I did it," Lucas exclaimed, throwing his arms around both of them. "We saw," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You were incredible." Henry knelt to Lucas's level, his hands resting on his son's shoulders. "I'm so proud of you, buddy." Lucas hugged him tightly before turning to Sarah. "Does this mean I'm like your Timmy now?" The question hung in the air, raw and unexpected. Sarah's eyes widened, her breath catching. "Lucas, you're you. And that's more than enough. But you love me like a mom, right?" Lucas asked, his voice earnest. Tears filled Sarah's eyes, and she nodded, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "Yes, sweetheart. I love you very much." Henry stood, his throat tight as he watched the exchange. For all his initial reservations, he realized that Sarah had become a part of their lives in a way he hadn't anticipated, but one he couldn't imagine being without. Later that evening, as they sat together in the living room, Lucas fell asleep on the couch, his head resting on Sarah's lap. Henry leaned forward, his hands clasped as he spoke quietly. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About staying. About what's next." Sarah looked at him, her expression guarded but hopeful. "I don't want this to be temporary," Henry said. "Lucas needs you. I need you. And if you're willing, I'd like you to stay. Not as a guest, but as part of our family." Tears brimmed in Sarah's eyes, but she smiled. "Henry, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Henry said simply. "We'll figure out the rest together." She looked down at Lucas, then back at Henry. "Yes." In that moment, the weight of their past seemed to lift, replaced by the promise of a shared future. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't always be easy, but it was real. And for Henry, Sarah, and Lucas, it was more than enough. It was everything. Sometimes, the people we least expect can transform our lives in ways we never imagined. What if the change you're waiting for is closer than you think? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to check out our next videos for more stories that inspire and challenge your perspective. See you there.